Sometimes the greatest act of courage comes not from battle, but from the moment we choose to save a stranger. Love can bloom in the darkest of winters when two souls recognize something precious in each other. The morning Hrolf Stronghand heard that desperate scream echo across the frozen fjord, he never hesitated. The giant Viking threw off his cloak and dove into waters cold enough to kill. Below the ice, a woman in warrior's clothing fought against nets, pulling her down. He saved her life and brought her to his home. But she would give no name and spoke no homeland. When fever struck her that night, she whispered words in a foreign tongue. The truth slowly became clear. She was not just a survivor, she was a Frankish spy carrying dangerous secrets. Now Hrolf faced an impossible choice between his duty and his heart. Would protecting this woman destroy everything he loved? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The longhouse of Hrolf Stronghand stood like a mountain against the Norwegian coastline, its timber walls weathered by countless seasons of salt, spray, and winter storms. Smoke curled from its central hearth into the grey morning sky, carrying with it the scents of pine resin and roasted barley that had warmed his family's home for 3 generations. At 42 winters, Hrolf had earned his place as chieftain through deeds that men still spoke of in hushed tones around evening fires. The raid on the Saxon monastery, where he'd lifted a grown man with one hand, the sea battle where he'd stood alone against 5 Danish warriors and lived to tell the tale. Yet this morning, as he sat beside his carved oak table running his weathered fingers across its familiar grooves, Hrolf felt the weight of leadership settling on his broad shoulders like a heavy cloak. The ice-cracked rescue stone sat before him, smooth and grey as the fjord waters where he'd found it, clutched in his fist after pulling the mysterious woman to safety 3 days prior. He'd meant to cast it aside, but something about its perfect roundness, worn smooth by countless tides, made him keep it close. His hall stretched before him, its length capable of housing 50 warriors during the fighting season. Carved dragon heads gazed down from the support beams, their eyes seeming to follow his movements as he paced. The long tables bore the scars of countless feasts and war councils, rings from ale horns and knife marks from men who'd settled disputes with steel rather than words. Tapestries hung between the wooden columns, depicting the great deeds of his father Bjorn Ironshield and his grandfather Gunnar the Bold, men whose legends cast long shadows that Hrolf sometimes struggled to match. The sound of footsteps on the wooden floor drew his attention. Astrid, his trusted housekeeper, emerged from the sleeping alcove where their mysterious guest had lain recovering. Her greying hair was pulled back in the practical braid of a woman who'd seen 6 decades of life, and her pale blue eyes held the wisdom that came from raising 5 children and burying 2 husbands. "She wakes," Astrid said simply, wiping her hands on the woolen apron tied around her thick waist. "But she speaks little. When I brought her broth, she watched me like a cornered wolf, ready to flee at the first sign of danger." Hrolf nodded, setting down the rescue stone with a soft click against the oak. "Has she given a name?" "None that rings true. She calls herself Sigrid when pressed, but the way she says it—" Astrid shook her greying head. "It sits on her tongue like an ill-fitting boot, and her hands, Hrolf, they're soft for a warrior, yet marked with ink stains." "What Viking woman writes?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the central fire. Hrolf had noticed the same inconsistencies. The woman's weapon bore no clan markings. Her clothing was finely woven, but foreign in its cut, and beneath the rough wool lay a silver chain that caught the firelight in ways that spoke of southern craftsmanship. "Bring her to me," Hrolf said finally. "If she's strong enough to stand, she's strong enough to answer questions." Astrid's weathered face creased with concern. "Be gentle with her, my lord. Whatever brought her to our waters, it wasn't by choice." The terror in her eyes runs deeper than fear of drowning. As his housekeeper retreated to fetch their guest, Hrolf moved to the great chair that had belonged to his father, a massive seat carved from a single piece of oak, its arms worn smooth by generations of chieftains' hands. The morning light streaming through the smoke hole illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, and for a moment he felt the presence of those who had ruled before him. What would they counsel? How did a man balance honor with the strange stirring in his chest that had begun the moment he'd looked into those frightened green eyes? The woman who entered his hall moved with the careful steps of someone still weak from her ordeal, yet her spine remained straight and her chin raised with quiet dignity. She wore one of Astrid's spare dresses, the brown wool simple but clean, yet somehow she made it seem elegant. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, still damp from washing, and when she lifted her gaze to meet his, Hrolf felt something tighten in his chest. "You summoned me, Lord," she said, her voice carrying the faint musical accent that marked her as foreign-born. The Norse words came precisely, as if each one had been carefully considered before spoken. "I summoned Sigrid," Hrolf replied, leaning forward in his chair. "But I wonder if that's truly who stands before me." A flicker of something fear, calculation, passed across her features before she composed herself. "I am grateful for your kindness, Lord Hrolf. You saved my life, and your household has shown me nothing but courtesy. I would not repay such gifts with deception, yet deception hangs about you like morning mist." Hrolf stood, his full height making her crane her neck to meet his eyes. "Your sword bears no clan marks, your clothing speaks of southern weavers, and last night in your fever you spoke words in the Frankish tongue." Her composure cracked for just an instant, like ice under spring sun, before reforming. "Men say many things when fever takes them, my lord. Dreams and nightmares blend together." "Dreams," Hrolf repeated softly, moving closer. "Is that what brought you to my fjord, tangled in fishing nets like some strange catch of the sea? Dreams?" She stepped back, her hand moving instinctively to where a weapon would hang, finding only empty air. The gesture was trained, automatic, the movement of someone who'd worn a blade for years. "I remember little of how I came to be in your waters, Lord. Perhaps my ship was taken by storms. Perhaps—" Hrolf circled her slowly, noting how her eyes tracked his movement while her body remained still. "But storms don't explain the seal hidden in your belongings, the one bearing the mark of the Frankish court." This time she couldn't hide her reaction. Her face went pale as fresh snow, and her breathing quickened. For a moment, Hrolf thought she might flee or fight, but instead she straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "What do you want from me?" she asked simply. The question caught him off guard. In that moment, her mask slipped entirely, revealing not a cunning spy or dangerous enemy, but a woman far from home, alone and afraid, yet still defiant. The sight stirred something protective in Hrolf's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his wife's death 5 years past. "I want the truth," he said gently. "Not because I wish you harm, but because lies are poor foundation stones for the trust that might grow between us." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something he couldn't name. "And if the truth is dangerous, if it brings harm to this household that has shown me only kindness, then we'll face that danger when it comes." Hrolf returned to his chair, gesturing for her to sit on the bench across from him. "Better to speak them in friendship than have them torn from you by enemies." She sank onto the wooden bench, her composure finally cracking enough to show her exhaustion. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My name is Celeste. I was a translator in the court of King Louis. 3 weeks ago, I discovered something that could start a war between our peoples." The words hung in the air between them like a drawn blade. Hrolf felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders, the sense that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't foresee. Yet as he looked at this woman, Celeste, sitting across from him with her chin raised and her green eyes bright with unshed tears, he found he didn't regret the choice to save her. "Tell me," he said simply, and settled back to listen to the tale that would reshape both their worlds. Celeste's hands trembled as she reached beneath the neckline of her borrowed dress, withdrawing a thin leather cord that held a small bronze cylinder no longer than a man's thumb. The artifact caught the firelight, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering glow. This was the Frankish royal cipher, a device used to decode the most sensitive correspondence of King Louis's court. "This is why I fled," she said, placing the cylinder on the oak table between them. 3 weeks ago, I was translating routine dispatches when I discovered something that wasn't meant for my eyes. A secret alliance between King Louis and the Danish Jarls. They plan to use Viking raiders as a distraction while Frankish forces move north to claim Norwegian territories. Hrolf stared at the small device, understanding immediately why men would kill for it. "You read this yourself?" "I decoded the message personally. The plan is elaborate. Danish gold flows to specific Jarls who will increase their raids on English monasteries, drawing Saxon attention south. Meanwhile, Frankish ships will sail north under the guise of trade, establishing fortified settlements along our coast." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the relief of sharing her burden evident. "Your people are being used, Hrolf. The Danes care nothing for Viking honor. They've sold it to the Franks for silver." The weight of her revelation settled on Hrolf's shoulders like armor made of stone. If her words proved true, the traditional Viking way of life faced extinction. Independent Jarls would become Frankish puppets, and Norwegian territories would fall under southern rule. "Why bring this to me?" he asked. "Why not sail directly to King Harold or one of the great Jarls?" Celeste's laugh held no humor. "Because I discovered something else in those dispatches. One of your own Jarls is already in Frankish pay. The messages spoke of the Northern Wolf, someone close to your king who provides information about Norwegian defenses and ship movements." Hrolf's blood chilled. The Northern Wolf was no random code name. It described someone with intimate knowledge of Norwegian military secrets. "Do you know who?" The dispatches were careful not to name him directly, but the timing of the messages suggests someone who attended your spring assembly at Trondheim. Someone trusted by King Harold himself. The implications hit Hrolf like a physical blow. The spring assembly had included only 20 of Norway's most powerful Jarls, men he'd known since childhood, warriors who'd fought beside his father. The thought that one of them had betrayed their people for Frankish silver made his stomach turn. "Why should I believe you?" he asked, though even as he spoke the words, he knew she was telling the truth. Her fear was too genuine, her knowledge too specific to be fabricated. "Because I risked everything to bring you this warning," Celeste replied. "I stole the cipher and fled in the dead of night. Frankish soldiers pursued me to the coast. I barely escaped in a fishing boat. When the storm hit, I thought my mission had failed." Her green eyes met his steadily, until a giant Viking dove into freezing water to save a stranger. Hrolf picked up the bronze cylinder, feeling its weight. Such a small thing to carry such enormous consequences. "If what you say is true, bringing this knowledge to King Harold could prevent a war. But it could also start one if he decides to strike first against the Franks." "There's more," Celeste said quietly. "The dispatches mentioned a specific date. The Frankish fleet will sail when the moon turns dark 3 months hence. If they're not stopped, by spring your coastline will be dotted with their fortresses." The timing made Hrolf's heart race. 3 months would bring them to the heart of winter, when most Viking ships were pulled ashore and warriors stayed close to their hearths. The Franks had chosen their moment well. Few would expect an invasion during the harshest season. "You've given me an impossible choice," Hrolf said finally. "Trust the word of a foreign woman and potentially destabilize the kingdom, or remain silent and watch my people become unwitting pawns in a Frankish game." "I know what I'm asking of you," Celeste said. "In your position, I might make the same calculation. But consider this, I could have taken this knowledge to the Danes, sold it to the highest bidder, or simply disappeared into the southern kingdoms. Instead, I chose to warn the people who will suffer most from this deception. Astrid appeared in the doorway, her weathered face creased with worry. My lord, riders approach under the banner of Jarl Magnus Bloodaxe. They'll reach the gates within the hour. Hrolf felt ice form in his veins. Magnus was his closest neighbour and oldest friend, a man who'd fought beside Hrolf's father in a dozen battles. He was also one of the Jarls who'd attended the spring assembly at Trondheim. Prepare the hall for guests, he instructed Astrid, his mind racing. Was this coincidence, or had Magnus somehow learned of Celeste's presence? And move our guest to the rear chamber. Say nothing of her to anyone. As Astrid hurried away, Hrolf turned to Celeste. Magnus Bloodaxe arrives. Do you know this name from your dispatches? Her face went pale. The Northern Wolf, one message referenced the axe that cuts both ways. I thought it was metaphorical, but if this Magnus carries the name Bloodaxe, then my oldest friend may be the traitor, Hrolf finished grimly, and his timing suggests he knows exactly why you're here. The sound of hoofbeats echoed across the courtyard, growing louder with each passing moment. Celeste gripped the cipher cylinder tightly, her knuckles white against the bronze. What will you do? Hrolf stood, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the hall. The rescue stone sat on the table between them, smooth and unchanging, a reminder of the moment his simple life had become impossibly complex. In saving this woman, he'd pulled himself into a web of intrigue that could reshape the entire Norse world. I'll do what honor demands, he said finally. But first, we'll see what Magnus has to say. If he's innocent, we'll need his help. If he's the Northern Wolf, Hrolf's hand moved to the axe at his belt. Then this conversation ends differently than he expects. The heavy wooden doors of the longhouse creaked open, and Magnus Bloodaxe strode into the hall with the confidence of a man who'd never questioned his welcome. His greying beard was braided with silver rings, and his blue eyes swept the room with the practiced gaze of a veteran warrior. Behind him came 4 of his house guards, their hands resting casually on their weapon hilts. "Hrolf Stronghand," Magnus called out, his voice booming in the timber hall. "I bring greetings from the north, and news that concerns us both." "Magnus, old friend," Hrolf replied, forcing warmth into his voice, while his mind calculated distances to weapons and exits. "What brings you to my hall on such a cold morning?" Magnus's smile didn't quite reach his eyes as he approached the high table. "Strange stories reach my ears, Hrolf. Tales of mysterious women pulled from the sea, and Frankish ships spotted in our waters. I thought it wise to investigate such rumors personally." The words confirmed Hrolf's worst fears. Magnus knew far too much about recent events to be here by chance. Either the Northern Wolf sat before him, or someone else was feeding information to the enemy. In either case, Celeste's life, and perhaps his own, hung in the balance of the next few moments. Hrolf forced his expression to remain neutral as Magnus approached, though every instinct screamed danger. The older Jarl's casual mention of Frankish ships and mysterious women was too specific to be coincidental. Behind Magnus, his 4 guards spread out in a formation that looked casual but blocked the main exits, a maneuver Hrolf recognized from countless raids. "Frankish ships?" Hrolf asked, settling into his carved chair with deliberate calm. "That's troubling news indeed. Where were they spotted?" Magnus took the offered seat across from him, his fingers drumming against the oak table. 3 leagues north of your territory, sailing under merchant flags. But my scouts noted they rode low in the water, the way ships do when carrying armed men rather than trade goods." His pale eyes studied Hrolf's face. "I thought you should know, given your coastline's vulnerability." The implied threat wasn't lost on Hrolf. Magnus knew the strategic weaknesses of every settlement along this stretch of coast knowledge that would prove invaluable to Frankish invaders. "I appreciate your concern for my people's safety, but surely you didn't ride through winter cold merely to share sailing rumors?" Not rumors, old friend. Facts. Magnus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. The woman you pulled from the fjord, where is she now? Hrolf's heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice remained steady. Recovering in Astrid's care. The poor thing nearly drowned, and fever took her for 2 days. Why do you ask? Because she's no simple drowning victim. I have it on good authority that she carries something of great value, something that certain parties would pay handsomely to recover. The bronze cipher seemed to burn against Hrolf's chest, where he'd hidden it beneath his woolen tunic. Celeste had been right to flee. Powerful forces were already mobilizing to silence her. What manner of valuable thing would a half-drowned woman possess? Magnus's smile turned predatory. Don't insult my intelligence, Hrolf. We've known each other too long for such games. The woman is a Frankish spy, and she carries documents that could embarrass certain noble persons. Simply hand her over, and this unpleasantness ends. Hand her over to whom? Hrolf asked, rising slowly from his chair. His full height made Magnus crane his neck upward, a subtle reminder of physical dominance. You speak of noble persons and embarrassing documents, but you've yet to explain your own interest in this matter. One of Magnus's guards stepped forward, his hand now openly resting on his sword. Lord Magnus doesn't require explanations from oath-breakers who harbour enemies of the realm. The insult hung in the air like a drawn blade. Hrolf's own men, working around the hall's periphery, stopped their tasks to listen. The accusation of oath-breaking was among the gravest charges one Viking could level against another. Choose your words carefully, Hrolf said, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. Guest right protects you under my roof, but it doesn't shield your tongue from consequences. Magnus raised a placating hand, though his eyes remained cold. Peace, Hrolf. Eric speaks from loyalty, not malice. But the fact remains, harboring this woman puts you in a dangerous position. There are forces at work larger than either of us. Surrender her, and I guarantee your household's safety. Guarantee it to whom? Hrolf pressed. Who commands Magnus Bloodaxe to make such promises? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Magnus's weathered features. He'd revealed too much, spoken with the confidence of a man backed by powerful allies. I command myself, as always, but I've lived long enough to recognize when a storm approaches. This woman brings trouble that will consume us all, if not handled properly. Astrid appeared at the hall's far end, moving with the unhurried pace of an experienced servant. Her presence provided Hrolf with a moment to think, to consider his rapidly narrowing options. Magnus's knowledge was too specific, his confidence too complete. He was either the Northern Wolf himself, or acting on the wolf's orders. Astrid, Hrolf called, not taking his eyes off Magnus. How fares our guest this morning? The older woman's face revealed nothing as she approached. Still weak, my lord, but her fever has broken. She asks constantly about the man who saved her life. Her emphasis on the word saved was subtle but clear. Celeste was listening and would understand the danger. Magnus leaned back in his chair, studying the exchange. A touching loyalty, but sentiment won't protect her from the forces that hunt her. Be reasonable, Hrolf. What is one foreign woman against the safety of your entire household? She's under my protection, Hrolf said simply. That makes her one of mine. Even if protecting her means war? The question struck like a physical blow. Magnus knew about the cipher's contents, knew the implications of Celeste's knowledge. Only someone deeply involved in the conspiracy would understand how her information could trigger conflict between kingdoms. War comes when it chooses, Hrolf replied, but it doesn't come through my hall wearing friendship's mask. Magnus sighed, rising from his seat with the fluid motion of a man who'd made his decision. I hoped it wouldn't come to this, old friend. I truly did. But you forced my hand. The words were a signal. Magnus's guards drew their swords in perfect unison, steel singing against leather scabbards. Around the hall, Hrolf's household workers scrambled for cover as the pretense of courtesy shattered like thin ice. 5 against 1 hardly seems sporting, Hrolf observed, his hand moving to his own weapon. Where's the honor in such odds? Honor? Magnus laughed bitterly. Honor is a luxury we can no longer afford. The world changes, Hrolf. Those who adapt survive. Those who cling to old ways perish. Then I'll perish as I lived. Hrolf replied, drawing his massive war axe. The weapon's steel head caught the firelight, casting dancing shadows across the hall's carved pillars. But I won't die alone. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Magnus's guards moved with the precision of men who'd fought together for years, their coordinated assault designed to overwhelm through sheer momentum. But they'd made one crucial error. They'd underestimated the reach of Hrolf's weapon and the confined space of the hall. Hrolf's first swing took the leftmost attacker across the chest, sending him crashing into a wooden pillar with bone-crushing force. His return stroke caught the second guard's sword arm, separating steel from flesh in a spray of crimson. The third guard pressed his advantage, lunging forward with his blade aimed at Hrolf's heart. But the giant Viking had fought in spaces far more confined than this hall. He pivoted on his heel, letting the thrust pass harmlessly by, then brought his axe handle up in a devastating uppercut that lifted his attacker off his feet. Magnus and his remaining guard retreated toward the door, their confident expressions replaced by wariness. They'd expected a quick capture, not a prolonged battle in Hrolf's own stronghold. This ends now. Magnus, Hrolf called, advancing with measured steps. Call off your man and we'll settle this between us as it should be. The older Jarl's response was to draw his own blade, a fine weapon with silver wire wrapped around its grip. Some endings write themselves, old friend. The only choice is whether we meet them with dignity or desperation. The clash of steel against steel rang through the hall as Hrolf and Magnus met in combat, their weapons sparking in the firelight. 20 years of friendship dissolved in that first exchange, replaced by the grim reality that one of them would not leave this hall alive. Magnus fought with the calculated precision of a veteran warrior, his silver-wrapped blade weaving patterns designed to find gaps in Hrolf's guard. But Hrolf's reach advantage and superior strength gradually told. His massive axe forced Magnus to give ground, each swing requiring desperate parries that sent vibrations up the older man's arms. Behind Magnus, his last remaining guard circled wide, seeking an opening to strike at Hrolf's back. "Yield, Magnus," Hrolf called between exchanges. "This doesn't have to end in blood." "It ended in blood the moment you chose her over your own people," Magnus replied, launching a vicious cut at Hrolf's neck that whistled through empty air. "You don't understand the forces at work here, the careful balance that keeps our lands from burning." Hrolf's counterattack drove Magnus back against the carved pillar, the older Jarl's eyes widening as he realized his disadvantage. What balance? Selling our independence to Frankish gold, turning Viking against Viking for foreign masters? The accusation struck home. Magnus's face contorted with rage and something that might have been shame. "You speak of things you don't comprehend. The Franks come, whether we resist or not. At least this way some of us survive with honor intact." Honor? Hrolf's axe sheared through Magnus's guard, the flat of the blade striking his shoulder and sending him stumbling. "There's no honor in betrayal, old friend. Only the bitter taste of silver coins." The remaining guard chose that moment to attack, his sword aimed at the gap between Hrolf's ribs. But Astrid, moving with surprising speed for her age, swung a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, catching the warrior across the temple. He dropped like a felled tree, his weapon clattering across the wooden floor. "My thanks," Hrolf called to his faithful housekeeper without taking his eyes off Magnus, who was struggling to raise his damaged sword arm. "Though I had the matter well in hand." "Of course you did, my lord," Astrid replied dryly, retrieving the fallen guard's weapon. "But these old bones appreciate efficiency." Magnus sagged against the pillar, his breathing labored and blood seeping through his woolen tunic. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the hollow look of a man who'd gambled everything and lost. "You've doomed us all." Hrolf. The woman's knowledge changes nothing, the wheels are already in motion. All you've accomplished is ensuring your own destruction. Then tell me who leads this conspiracy, Hrolf demanded, pressing the edge of his axe against Magnus's throat. Give me the Northern Wolf's true name, and perhaps some good can come from this tragedy. Magnus's laugh turned into a cough that brought blood to his lips. You think there's only one wolf in this pack? The corruption runs deeper than you imagine, reaches higher than you dare suspect. Even if you killed every traitor in Norway, the Frankish ships would still come. Names, Magnus. Give me names and I'll ensure your household survives what's coming. For a moment, the older Jarl's eyes softened, and Hrolf glimpsed the friend who'd fought beside his father, who'd shared countless meals at this very table. Then the moment passed, and Magnus's expression hardened with resolve. My household is already protected by powers greater than yours. As for names, discover them yourself, if you live long enough. Before Hrolf could react, Magnus drew a small knife from his boot and drove it toward his own heart. Hrolf's hand shot out, catching Magnus's wrist just inches from the fatal blow, but the older man twisted with surprising strength. The blade found its mark, sliding between ribs to pierce the lung beneath. Why? Hrolf asked, lowering Magnus gently to the floor as blood frothed at his lips. Why throw away everything we built together? Magnus's voice came in a whisper, each word an effort. Because I saw the future, and in it, our children served Frankish masters or fed ravens on forgotten battlefields. This way, some of them lived to see another spring. His eyes closed for the final time, leaving Hrolf kneeling beside the body of his oldest friend. The hall fell silent except for the crackling of the central fire and the distant sound of wind through the eaves. Astrid moved quietly among the fallen guards, checking for signs of life and finding none. "What do we do now, my lord?" she asked, her voice heavy with the weight of what they'd witnessed. Hrolf stood slowly, his joints protesting after the violent exertion. The rescue stone sat on the table where he'd left it, unchanged by the blood that now stained his hall. "We prepare for war, Astrid." Magnus spoke truly about one thing: the wheels are in motion, and we can no longer stop them. We can only choose how we meet what's coming. Celeste emerged from the rear chamber, still wearing Astrid's simple brown dress, but moving with new purpose. She'd heard everything, understood the implications of Magnus's words. "He wasn't the Northern Wolf," she said quietly. "He was a tool, manipulated by someone with far greater reach and influence." "How can you be certain?" Hrolf asked, wiping Magnus's blood from his axe blade. "Because he genuinely believed he was protecting Norwegian interests, even as he served Frankish ones. The real Northern Wolf would know better, would understand that collaboration is just another word for surrender." She moved to the window, gazing out at the grey waters of the fjord. "We need to reach King Harald before the conspiracy moves against us directly." Hrolf joined her at the window, noting how naturally she spoke of us now, as if their fates had become intertwined by blood and necessity. "The journey to Trondheim will take 5 days if the weather holds, but Magnus's men will report our location to whoever sent them. We'll be hunted every mile of the way." "Then we leave tonight," Celeste said simply. "Before word spreads that Magnus Bloodaxe is dead and his mission failed. Once they know we've discovered the conspiracy, they'll throw everything they have at stopping us." Astrid moved to Hrolf's side, her weathered hands steady despite the morning's violence. "The household can be ready within the hour, my lord. Your core warriors are loyal, they'll follow wherever you lead." Hrolf nodded, feeling the weight of decision settle on his shoulders. In saving one woman from the frozen fjord, he'd stumbled into a war that would reshape the Norse world. Yet as he looked at Celeste's determined profile and thought of Magnus's final words, he knew there had been no other choice. Some battles chose their warriors, rather than the other way around. "Send word to Eric Longbeard and Thorvald the Red," he instructed Astrid. Tell them Hrolf Stronghand calls in old debts, and the safety of Norway hangs in the balance. We sail for Trondheim with the evening tide." The longship Sea Wolf cut through dark waters under a moonless sky, her dragon prow splitting foam that glowed with an eerie phosphorescence. Hrolf stood at the steering oar, his massive frame silhouetted against the star-filled heavens as 20 loyal warriors pulled at their oars in rhythm with the ancient sea songs their fathers had sung. Beside him, wrapped in a heavy woolen cloak, Celeste clutched a leather satchel containing the bronze cipher and copies of the decoded messages, evidence that could save Norway or doom them all. The Raven's Feather, a black-sailed warship, had appeared on their wake 2 hours past sunset. Its crew rowed with the mechanical precision of professional killers, gaining steadily on the Sea Wolf despite Hrolf's men's best efforts. Whoever commanded that vessel wanted them dead badly enough to risk a night pursuit through treacherous coastal waters. "She gains on us," Eric Longbeard called from his position amidships, his greying beard whipping in the salt wind. The veteran warrior had answered Hrolf's summons without question, bringing 5 of his best men despite the obvious danger. "Another hour, and they'll be within arrow range." Hrolf adjusted their heading slightly, aiming for the narrow passage between Seal Island and the mainland shore. The channel was barely wide enough for a single longship, its waters treacherous with hidden rocks that had claimed vessels for generations. But it offered their only chance of escape if they could reach it before their pursuers closed the gap. "Who do you think commands the Raven's Feather?" Celeste asked, her voice steady despite the spray that soaked them both. During their hasty departure, she'd proven surprisingly comfortable aboard a warship, moving with sea legs that spoke of previous experience on deep waters. "Someone with access to fast ships and skilled crews," Hrolf replied grimly. "Magnus wasn't acting alone. His death merely alerted larger forces to our movements." He glanced at the pursuing vessel, noting the disciplined spacing of its oars and the way it maintained perfect course despite the darkness. "These men row like they know exactly where we're headed." Thorvald the Red, positioned near the bow as lookout, raised his hand in warning. "Seal Island passage ahead, but I see torches on the eastern shore. They've positioned men to block our escape." Hrolf cursed under his breath. The conspiracy's reach was even greater than he'd feared. They'd anticipated his tactics and moved to counter them. Traditional Viking raids relied on speed and surprise, but this enemy fought with the methodical planning of professional soldiers. "How many torches?" he called forward. "6 that I can count, possibly more hidden among the rocks. They're positioned to rain arrows down on any ship attempting the passage." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Drive them toward the narrow channel, then slaughter them in the confined waters where the Sea Wolf's superior seamanship counted for nothing. Hrolf's mind raced through alternatives, but each option seemed worse than the last. "There's another way," Celeste said quietly, studying the approaching coastline. "My ship, the one I escaped in before the storm, I hid supplies on Gull Rock, just north of here. If we could reach it—" "Gull Rock is a death trap," Eric interrupted, overhearing her words. "Sheer cliffs on all sides, no harbour, barely room to beach a small boat. Why would you cache anything there?" "Because no one else would think to look there," she replied simply. "The Frankish pursuit was closing in when I made landfall. I had to hide certain documents before taking to the water again." Hrolf felt his pulse quicken. "Names," Celeste said, meeting his gaze steadily. "A complete list of the Norwegian Jarls in Frankish pay, their contact methods, and the specific intelligence they've provided. I couldn't risk carrying everything in the cipher if I was captured. One lost device wouldn't compromise the entire network." The revelation struck like a physical blow. She'd been holding back crucial information, protecting secrets that could expose every traitor in Norway. "You should have told me this before we sailed." "I should have," she agreed. "But trust doesn't come easily when you've spent weeks running from killers. Now, with Magnus's death confirming the conspiracy's reach, I realize half measures will doom us all." The pursuing ship was close enough now that they could hear individual voices carried on the wind, commands issued in accented Norse, not native speakers, but foreigners who'd learned the language for this specific mission. Hrolf's suspicions crystallized into certainty. They faced Frankish agents, not merely corrupted Vikings. Gull Rock it is, he decided, throwing his weight against the steering oar to change their heading. Eric, prepare the men for a difficult landing. We'll have to beach the ship and climb, which leaves us vulnerable if those archers spot our movement. What about the Raven's Feather? Thorvald called back. They can't follow us up those cliffs, Hrolf replied, though he knew their pursuers wouldn't simply sail away. They'll wait offshore, watching for our return. We'll deal with that problem when we reach it. The Sea-Wolf rode the swells toward Gull Rock's forbidding silhouette, her crew pulling with renewed vigor now that they had a destination. Behind them, the pursuing vessel maintained its relentless pace, close enough that individual warriors were visible in their torchlight. "There's something else you should know," Celeste said as they approached the rock's base. "The documents I hid, they include correspondence between the Northern Wolf and someone called the Iron Crown. Based on the language used, I believe the Iron Crown represents Frankish royal authority directly." Hrolf absorbed this news with growing dread. If King Louis himself was directing the conspiracy, then Norway faced not just corruption within its ranks, but a coordinated invasion backed by one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. The scope of the threat dwarfed anything the Viking world had previously encountered. The Sea-Wolf's keel scraped against submerged stone as they reached Gull Rock's narrow beach, little more than a shelf of broken granite, barely wide enough for their vessel. Waves crashed against the cliffs above, sending spray cascading down in silver sheets that caught the starlight. "Secure the ship," Hrolf ordered, leaping into knee-deep water. "Eric, take half the men and establish a perimeter. If those archers spot us, we'll need covering fire for the retreat." As his warriors dispersed among the rocks, Hrolf helped Celeste ashore, noting how her hands shook despite her outward calm. The magnitude of what she'd carried alone, the weight of secrets that could reshape kingdoms, was finally showing its toll. "How far up?" he asked, studying the cliff face that rose like a stone wall into darkness. 70 feet, perhaps 80, she replied, pointing to a barely visible ledge. "There's a sea cave behind that overhang. That's where I cached the documents before the storm forced me back to the water." The climb would be treacherous in daylight, potentially fatal in darkness. But with the Raven's Feather closing fast and archers positioned to command the sea approaches, they had no other choice. The climb up Gull Rock's treacherous face tested every skill Hrolf had learned in decades of warfare. Salt spray made the granite slick as ice, and loose stones cascaded into the darkness below with each handhold. Celeste climbed beside him with surprising agility, her fingers finding cracks and ledges that his larger hands could barely grip. Behind them, the Raven's Feather had drawn close enough that they could hear shouted orders as their pursuers debated whether to risk the dangerous landing. "The cave is just ahead," Celeste whispered, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "There, behind that outcropping." Hrolf squinted through the darkness, making out a narrow opening barely wide enough for a man to enter sideways. The ledge before it was no more than 2 feet wide, with a sheer drop to the rocks below. One misstep would send them tumbling to their deaths in the surf. "Stay close," he murmured, pressing himself against the cliff face as he edged along the ledge. "Don't look down." The sea cave extended deeper into the rock than he'd expected, its floor littered with smooth stones, polished by centuries of tidal action. Celeste produced a small oil lamp from her satchel, its flickering light revealing passages that disappeared into the island's heart. The air smelled of brine and something else, old metal and leather, the scent of hidden things long undisturbed. "Here," she said, leading him to a natural alcove near the cave's rear wall. I wrapped everything in oiled leather and sealed it in this iron chest, a precaution in case the cave flooded during storms. The container she revealed was about the size of a man's head, its surface green with verdigris but still sound. This was the Sea Witch's coffer, a relic she'd carried from the Frankish court, designed to protect documents from water damage during long sea voyages. Celeste's hands shook as she worked the complex lock mechanism, a series of bronze wheels that had to be aligned precisely. "Tell me what we'll find inside," Hrolf said, watching the cave entrance for signs of pursuit. The sound of waves crashing against rocks below echoed strangely in the confined space, making it difficult to distinguish natural noises from human movement. Names, as I said, but also much more. The lock clicked open with a sound like breaking ice. Payment records showing exactly how much Frankish gold each traitor received. Copies of intelligence reports harbour defences, troop movements, the locations of weapon caches. And most damaging of all, the Northern Wolf's personal correspondence with King Louis himself. She lifted the lid, revealing neat stacks of parchment wrapped in waxed cloth. Even in the lamp's weak light, Hrolf could see the documents represented months of careful intelligence gathering. "How did you obtain all this without raising suspicion?" "By being invisible," Celeste replied, carefully removing the documents. "Court translators are like furniture to nobles present when needed, ignored otherwise. I had access to correspondence in a dozen languages, including coded messages that required my skills to decode. Over time, I began to notice patterns." She handed him a thick sheaf of parchments, their surfaces covered with neat script in multiple hands. The conspiracy began small, a few jarls, accepting payment for information about English raids. But it grew rapidly once the Franks realized how effectively they could manipulate Viking politics. Within 2 years, they had agents in place throughout Norway's leadership. Hrolf scanned the documents by lamplight, his rage growing with each familiar name. Jarl Ragnar the Bold, who'd sworn brotherhood with Hrolf's father. Olaf Goldbeard, whose ships had fought beside the Sea-Wolf in a dozen battles. Even Gunnar Ironside, King Harald's own cousin, appeared on the lists of those who'd sold information for Frankish silver. "This is worse than I imagined," he said finally. "Half the jarls in Norway are compromised. If these records are accurate, the Franks know everything: our defences, our ship strengths, even the locations where we store weapons and supplies for winter." "It gets worse," Celeste said, producing a final document sealed with black wax. "This arrived at the Frankish court 3 days before I fled. It's the Northern Wolf's latest report, and it identifies King Harald's planned winter movements. If the Franks act on this intelligence..." The sound of steel against stone echoed from the cave entrance, cutting her words short. Torchlight flickered in the opening as armed figures squeezed through the narrow passage. Their pursuers had found them, and the cave's confines offered no room for maneuver. "How many?" Hrolf asked, drawing his war axe despite the impossibility of wielding it effectively in such close quarters. "6 that I can see," Celeste replied, quickly gathering the scattered documents, but more could be climbing behind them. The first attacker emerged into the cave's main chamber, his sword gleaming in the combined light of torches and oil lamp. He wore no clan markings, but his equipment bore the fine craftsmanship that marked him as either wealthy or professionally equipped. Behind him came others, moving with the coordinated precision of men who'd fought together extensively. "Surrender the documents and the woman," called their leader, his accent confirming Hrolf's suspicions about Frankish involvement. "You're trapped here, with nowhere to run. Make this simple, and we'll grant you a warrior's death." "Counter-offer," Hrolf replied, shifting his grip on the axe handle. "Leave now, and I'll let some of you reach the boats alive." The Frankish agent laughed, but there was no humour in the sound. 6 against 1 hardly seems sporting, Viking. But then, we're not here for sport. The attack came without warning, 3 men rushing forward while their companions provided support with thrown daggers and crossbow bolts. Hrolf's axe swept in a devastating arc that filled the cave with sparks as steel met stone, forcing his attackers to scramble backward. But the confines that limited his weapon's effectiveness also prevented coordinated assault. They could only approach one or two at a time. Celeste pressed herself against the cave wall, clutching the iron coffer and its precious contents, while Hrolf fought for their lives. In the flickering light, she saw something the attackers had missed, a narrow passage at the cave's rear, barely visible behind a curtain of mineral deposits. If they could reach it, Hrolf, she called, pointing toward the hidden opening. Behind you, there's another way out. The giant Viking risked a glance backward, noting the passage she'd indicated. It looked barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, but it led deeper into the island's heart, possibly to freedom, or simply to a different kind of trap. "Can you make it through?" he called, parrying a thrust that would have opened his throat. "Yes. But what about you?" Hrolf's grim smile was visible even in the chaotic light. "I'll be right behind you. Go." As Celeste squeezed through the narrow opening, Hrolf launched one final devastating attack that drove his enemies back toward the cave entrance. Then he followed her into the darkness, praying that the passage led somewhere other than a dead end beneath tons of ancient stone. The narrow passage through Gull Rock's heart opened into a natural chamber large enough to stand upright, its walls glistening with moisture that had seeped through cracks in the stone for countless centuries. Celeste's lamp revealed ancient carvings on the walls, runic inscriptions left by Vikings who'd sheltered here in ages past. But it was what lay at the chamber's center that stopped Hrolf's breath in his throat. A skeleton in rotted mail sat propped against the far wall, its bony fingers still clutching a leather scroll case. Beside the remains lay a golden arm ring bearing the royal seal of Norway, not the current design used by King Harold, but an older pattern that Hrolf recognized from his grandfather's stories. This was a king's messenger from decades past, someone who died carrying secrets to his grave. "The Dragon's Testament," Celeste whispered, reading the runic inscription carved into the wall above the skeleton. "I've seen references to this in the Frankish archives, but I thought it was legend." Hrolf knelt beside the ancient remains, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted the scroll case. The leather had partially rotted away, but the bronze fittings still held. Inside, wrapped in oiled silk that had somehow survived the decades, lay a document that made his blood run cold. The parchment bore the seal of King Magnus the Good, Harold's predecessor, and was addressed to the Jarls of Norway in script that grew more urgent with each line. But it wasn't the royal seal that made Hrolf's hands tremble, it was the signature at the bottom, written in a familiar hand that he'd seen countless times on messages and treaties. "This can't be right," he breathed, holding the document closer to the lamplight. "This says, 'That King Harold himself is the Northern Wolf,'" Celeste finished, reading over his shoulder. "That he's been in Frankish pay since before he took the throne, and that Magnus the Good discovered his treachery just before his death." The revelation struck like a physical blow. Every assumption about the conspiracy crumbled as Hrolf read the damning evidence. King Harold hadn't inherited a kingdom threatened by Frankish infiltration. He'd opened the gates himself, systematically compromising Norway's defences while maintaining the facade of strong leadership. "Magnus the Good tried to warn the Jarls," Hrolf said, his voice hollow with shock. "But Harold had him killed before the message could be delivered. This messenger must have hidden here when pursuit grew too close." Celeste studied the runic inscriptions more carefully, her knowledge of languages extending even to the ancient Norse dialects. "There's more here." Magnus mentions proof something called the Crown of Shadows that Harold uses to communicate directly with Frankish agents. "If we could find it." The sound of pursuit echoed from the passage behind them, cutting short her words. The Frankish agents had discovered their escape route and were following them into the rock's depths. But worse than the immediate danger was the crushing realization that their entire mission had been doomed from the start. They'd been racing to warn a king who was himself the enemy. "We have to reach the Jarls directly," Hrolf said, carefully folding the ancient testament and securing it in his tunic. "Eric, Longbeard. Thorvald, the red men who knew my father and would trust his son's word over royal authority. But Harold controls the kingdom's communication networks," Celeste pointed out as they searched for another exit. "Any message we send will be intercepted by his agents. And now that Magnus Bloodaxe is dead, Harold knows we're investigating the conspiracy." A terrible thought occurred to Hrolf as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. That's why Magnus seemed so confident he wasn't just another traitor. He was Harold's personal agent, sent to eliminate us before we could uncover the truth. His talk of protecting Norwegian interests was genuine in his mind because he believed Harold's version of events. The chamber's far wall revealed another passage, this one sloping upward toward what might be the island's surface. But as they prepared to climb, torchlight appeared in the opening behind them. Their pursuers had found the hidden chamber and would discover the dragon's testament's hiding place within moments. "The bones," Celeste said urgently. "We have to make it look like we never found them." Working quickly, they repositioned the skeleton and scroll case to appear undisturbed, scattering dust and debris to hide signs of their presence. If the Frankish agents discovered the testament's existence, they'd know exactly how much Hrolf and Celeste had learned about Harold's true nature. The upward passage proved even more treacherous than their previous climb, its surfaces slick with condensation and loose stone. But it led toward fresher air and the distant sound of wind, suggesting an exit somewhere above. Behind them, voices echoed in the chamber as their pursuers examined the ancient remains. "Did they find it?" Hrolf asked as they climbed. "I don't think so," Celeste replied, listening to the foreign voices below. "They're speaking Frankish now, assuming we can't understand. Something about maintaining the deception and protecting the crown's investment." They emerged onto Gulrock's summit through a crack between two massive boulders, the cold night air striking their faces like a physical blow after the cave's stifling atmosphere. Below them, the Sea-Wolf waited at anchor, while Eric's men maintained their defensive positions among the rocks. The Raven's feather had drawn closer, but hadn't yet attempted a landing. "Now what?" Celeste asked, studying the documents she'd retrieved from the sea cave. "Everything we thought we knew has been turned upside down. If Harold is the Northern Wolf, then the entire Norwegian royal court is compromised." Hrolf looked out over the dark waters toward the mainland, where lights twinkled in distant settlements that had no idea their king had sold them to foreign masters. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like armor made of lead. He alone carried knowledge that could either save Norway or tear it apart in civil war. "We change tactics," he said finally. "Instead of warning Harold about a Frankish invasion, we warn the people about Harold himself. But we'll need proof more compelling than ancient documents and decoded messages. We'll need to catch him in the act." "The Crown of Shadows," Celeste said, understanding immediately. "If we could find where he keeps it, obtain samples of his correspondence with the Franks, then we could expose him publicly at the winter assembly where all the Jarls gather." Hrolf felt a grim smile cross his face as a plan began to form. "It's dangerous if we're caught. No one will believe our accusations. But if we succeed, Norway might actually have a chance," she finished. Below them, shouts erupted from the cave entrance as the Frankish agents realized their quarry had escaped. Soon they'd be climbing toward the summit, seeking to finish what Magnus had started. But for the first time since pulling Celeste from the frozen fjord, Hrolf felt hope stirring in his chest. The enemy they faced was more dangerous than he'd imagined, but it was also more vulnerable. Corruption that ran to the very top of the kingdom could be exposed if they were clever enough to survive the attempt. The royal compound at Trondheim sprawled across a natural harbour like a sleeping giant, its timber halls and stone towers housing the most powerful men in Norway. From their concealment in the pine forest overlooking the settlement, Hrolf and Celeste watched the daily rhythms of court life unfold below. 3 weeks had passed since their escape from Gull Rock, 3 weeks of careful planning and dangerous reconnaissance that had brought them to this moment of truth. The crown of shadows must be in the king's private chambers, Celeste whispered, studying the layout through a brass spyglass she'd acquired from a merchant ship. I've observed the patterns Harold receives certain visitors after midnight, always alone, and they leave carrying sealed messages. The meetings happen too regularly to be coincidental. Hrolf nodded, his weathered hands working to carve runes into a piece of birchwood, the traitor's mark, that would serve as their signal if the mission went wrong. The winter assembly would begin in 2 days, bringing together every Jarl in Norway for the season's most important gathering. If they could expose Harold's treachery before that assembly, the kingdom might unite against the Frankish threat. If they failed, Norway would fragment into civil war while enemy ships sailed unopposed to its shores. "Eric and Thorvald are in position," he asked, not taking his eyes off the royal compound. "Eric watches the harbour with 10 men. If we need to escape by sea, he'll have the Sea Wolf ready. Thorvald covers the landward approaches with another 12 warriors, all men whose loyalty to your father runs deeper than any oath to Harold." Celeste folded the spyglass carefully, her movements precise, despite the tension that radiated from her like heat from forge fire. "But Hrolf, once we enter that compound, we're committed. There'll be no retreat if things go wrong." The truth of her words weighed heavily between them. They'd spent weeks gathering allies among the lesser Jarls, men whose territories lay far enough from the royal court to avoid corruption. The evidence they'd assembled was compelling decoded messages, payment records, even samples of Harold's correspondence with Frankish agents obtained through careful theft. But none of it would matter if they couldn't reach the crown of shadows itself. "Tell me again about the guard rotations," Hrolf said, testing the edge of his Seek's knife against his thumb. The blade drew a thin line of blood, sharp enough for the close work that lay ahead. 4 men patrol the inner courtyard, changing every 2 hours. The king's personal guards number 6, but 3 sleep while 3 stand watch. They trust the outer defenses to provide warning of any serious threat. Celeste had memorized every detail of the compound's security through patient observation and careful questioning of servants in the town's alahouses. The weakness is the postern gate on the eastern wall. It's watched, but only by 1 man, and he tends to doze near dawn. Hrolf studied the wooden figurines they'd carved to represent guard positions, his mind working through the timing that would be critical to their success. "Once we're inside, how long do we have?" 20 minutes, perhaps 30 if we're fortunate. The guards check the king's chambers irregularly, but never let more than half an hour pass without verification. And if Harold wakes, she didn't finish the thought. They both knew the consequences of discovery. The afternoon sun was westering toward the fjord when a commotion arose in the compound below. A ship had arrived flying royal colours, its crew disembarking with the urgency of men bearing important news. Through the spyglass, they watched as messengers hurried toward the great hall where Harold held court. "Frankish ship," Celeste breathed, her face paling as she recognized the vessel's lines. "That's the same design as the ships that pursued me from Louis's court. They're bringing new orders." Hrolf felt ice crystallize in his veins. If the Frankish agents were updating their Norwegian collaborators, it meant the invasion timeline was accelerating. Whatever window they had for exposing the conspiracy was closing rapidly. "We go tonight," he decided, though every tactical instinct screamed against rushing their carefully laid plans. If they're coordinating final preparations, we can't wait for the perfect moment. Celeste nodded, her jaw set with determination. Over the weeks they'd spent together, fleeing enemies and gathering evidence, something profound had grown between them, a trust deeper than mere alliance, a connection that made the thought of losing her more frightening than facing death itself. Tonight they would either save Norway together or die in the attempt. As darkness fell over Trondheim, they made their final preparations. Hrolf checked his weapons one last time: war axe, CX knife, and a Frankish dagger taken from one of Magnus's guards. Celeste carried her own blade along with the tools needed to copy documents quickly in the dark. Around her neck hung a chain bearing the rescue stone from the fjord, the smooth grey pebble that had started their entire journey. "Whatever happens in there," Hrolf said as they prepared to move, "know that pulling you from those waters was the most important thing I've ever done. Not just for Norway, but for me." Her green eyes caught the starlight as she met his gaze. "And knowing that someone like you exists in this world, someone who would risk everything for what's right, that gives me hope that we might actually succeed." They moved through the forest like shadows, their footsteps silent on the pine needles that carpeted the ground. The compound's outer walls loomed ahead, timber and stone barriers that had protected Norwegian kings for generations. Now those same walls defended a traitor who'd sold his people for Frankish gold. The postern gate stood exactly where Celeste had described, its single guard leaning against the wall with his spear resting across his knees. His breathing had the steady rhythm of a man fighting sleep, exactly the opportunity they'd hoped for. Hrolf approached from behind, while Celeste created a distraction, dropping a stone that clattered in the underbrush. The guard's head turned toward the sound, giving Hrolf the opening he needed. A massive hand clamped over the man's mouth, while the other applied pressure to his neck, cutting off blood flow to his brain. The guard slumped unconscious without uttering a sound, alive but helpless, as Hrolf preferred when dealing with men who might be innocent of their king's treachery. They slipped through the gate into the royal compound's inner sanctum, where the accumulated wealth and power of Norway's kings lay displayed in carved halls and treasure houses. But tonight they sought something more valuable than gold or silver. They sought the truth that could either unite the kingdom or tear it apart forever. Harold's private chambers lay at the heart of the complex, protected by layers of guards and walls that spoke to a king's healthy paranoia. Or perhaps, Hrolf thought grimly as they moved through shadows toward their destination, the paranoia of a man who knew exactly how many enemies his treachery had earned him. The night air carried voices from the great hall, where the king entertained his Frankish visitors with feast and ceremony. The sound of their laughter drifted across the compound like mockery, celebrating victories not yet won over an enemy that didn't yet know it faced invasion from within. "There," Celeste whispered, pointing toward a tower that rose above the surrounding buildings. "Second floor, corner window. I've seen him working there by candlelight, always alone, always with documents he keeps locked away." Hrolf studied the climb they'd need to make, noting the decorative carvings that would serve as handholds and the narrow ledges between floors. It was risky but possible if they moved quickly and the guards maintained their predictable patterns. "Ready?" he asked, knowing that once they began this ascent there would be no turning back. Celeste's smile held both fear and determination. "For Norway," she whispered. "For truth," Hrolf replied. And together they began their climb toward the chamber where a king's darkest secrets waited to be exposed. The climb up the tower's face tested every skill Hrolf had learned in decades of warfare, his massive frame moving with surprising grace between carved ravens and writhing serpents that decorated the royal residence. Beside him, Celeste ascended like a shadow, her smaller hands finding purchase where his could barely grip. The sounds of revelry from the great hall covered their movement, but one misplaced foot would send them plummeting to the courtyard stones below. Harold's chamber window glowed with candlelight, revealing the silhouette of a man bent over a writing desk. Through the thick glass, they could see him working methodically through a stack of documents, occasionally pausing to consult what appeared to be a bronze device, the crown of shadows itself gleaming in the flickering flames. "He's encoding messages," Celeste whispered, her breath forming clouds in the cold night air. "Look at the pattern of his movements. Write, encode, seal. Those dispatches will be on their way to Frankish agents before dawn." Hrolf tested the window frame with careful pressure, finding it secured by an iron latch that would require forcing. The sound would alert Harold instantly, but they had no other choice. "On my signal," he murmured, positioning his CX knife to pry the mechanism. The metal gave, with a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud in the still air. For a heartbeat, Harold continued writing, his concentration so complete that he missed the sound. Then his head snapped up, pale eyes scanning the room with the wariness of a man who'd survived countless assassination attempts. Hrolf and Celeste rolled through the window in perfect coordination, landing in fighting crouches with weapons drawn. The king's hand moved toward a bell that would summon guards, but Hrolf's axe appeared at his throat before he could complete the motion. "King Harold Ironhand," Hrolf said formally, though his voice carried the weight of absolute menace. "Or should I call you by your other name, the Northern Wolf?" Harold's composure cracked for just an instant, revealing the calculating mind beneath his royal facade. He was younger than Hrolf had expected, perhaps 40 winters, with the lean build of a man who'd earned his crown through cunning rather than strength. His clothing spoke of wealth and power, but his eyes held the hollow emptiness of a soul long sold. "I know you," Harold said slowly, his gaze shifting between his captors. "Hrolf Stronghand, Magnus Bloodaxe's friend." "And the woman?" His eyes narrowed as recognition dawned. "The Frankish translator who caused such inconvenience. I wondered when you might appear." "Then you know why we're here," Celeste said, moving to block his access to the door while keeping her blade ready. "We want the truth, all of it. How long have you been selling Norway to the Franks?" Harold's laugh held no humor. "Selling? You mistake my nature entirely. I'm not a merchant hawking goods in the marketplace. I'm a king preserving his people from total destruction." He gestured toward the window, where distant lights marked settlements along the fjord. "Do you see those villages, those farms and fishing boats? In 5 years, they'll still exist because of choices I've made. Under Frankish rule," Hrolf growled, pressing the axe edge closer to the royal throat. "As slaves in their own homeland. As living men instead of glorious corpses," Harold countered. "You Vikings cling to your outdated notions of honor while the world changes around you. The Franks have armies that could crush every warrior in Norway, fleets that make our longships look like children's toys. War with them means extinction." Celeste moved to the writing desk, examining the documents scattered across its surface. Her face paled as she read, understanding immediately what Harold had been composing. "These are sailing orders for Norwegian ships. You're not just providing intelligence, you're actively coordinating the invasion. I'm ensuring that when Frankish rule comes, and it will come, my people survive the transition," Harold said with icy calm. "Better to serve as jarls under a foreign king than to die as heroes in forgotten graves." The bronze device on the desk caught Hrolf's attention, an intricate mechanism covered in runic symbols that seemed to shift and change as the candlelight played across them. This was the Crown of Shadows, the tool Harold used to encode his treacherous correspondence. Evidence that would damn him before every honest jarl in Norway. "How many others?" Hrolf demanded. "How many of our leaders have you corrupted with Frankish gold?" Harold's smile turned predatory. "More than you know, fewer than you fear, but enough to ensure that when the moment comes, resistance will crumble like frost before the spring sun." His eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Magnus served me well, though he never understood the full scope of what we're building. His death was unfortunate, but necessary. You forced my hand when you chose to protect this woman." "And the Winter Assembly?" Celeste asked, still studying the documents. "What's your plan there?" "To announce the new alliance, of course. To present the jarls with a choice between submission and destruction, backed by Frankish ships in every harbour." Harold's composure remained unnaturally calm, despite the blade at his throat. "They'll choose survival, as reasonable men always do." Hrolf felt rage building in his chest like a forge fire. This man had betrayed everything the Viking people stood for, traded their independence for the promise of safety under foreign masters. Yet something in Harold's manner suggested this conversation was proceeding exactly as he'd planned. "You're too confident," Hrolf observed. "A man facing death should show more concern for his circumstances." Harold's smile widened. "Death? My dear Hrolf, who said anything about dying?" His hand moved with surprising speed toward a hidden mechanism beneath his desk. The floor gave way beneath them without warning, ancient hinges screaming as a concealed trapdoor opened to reveal the darkness below. Hrolf lunged forward, trying to grab Harold before they all fell, but the king had positioned himself perfectly to avoid the trap he'd just triggered. They plummeted into a stone chamber beneath the royal quarters, landing hard on straw-covered flagstones that did little to cushion their impact. Above them, Harold's laughter echoed through the opening as torches flared to life around the walls. They'd fallen directly into a purpose-built prison, its walls lined with iron bars and its single exit blocked by a massive door. "Welcome to my private dungeon," Harold called down from above. "I had it constructed years ago for guests who overstayed their welcome. The walls are 3 feet thick, the door requires keys that only I possess, and the guards who patrol this level answer solely to me." Celeste struggled to her feet, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. The crown of shadows lay beside her, apparently knocked from Harold's desk during their fall. She grabbed it quickly, understanding that it represented their only remaining evidence against the treacherous king. "Your evidence dies with you," Harold continued, his voice now distant as he moved away from the opening. "By morning, the story will spread that foreign assassins attempted to murder the king in his own chambers. Your deaths will provide the perfect justification for the security measures I'll announce at the Winter Assembly." The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving them alone in the torchlit cell, with the growing realization that their mission had transformed from exposure to mere survival. Above them, the trapdoor slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid, sealing them in the bowels of the royal compound with no apparent means of escape. The dungeon's stone walls seemed to press closer with each passing hour, their surfaces slick with moisture that spoke of chambers built below the water table. Hrolf tested every bar, every stone, seeking weakness in construction that had clearly been designed to hold the kingdom's most dangerous enemies. Beside him, Celeste worked frantically with the Crown of Shadows. Her knowledge of codes and ciphers focused on understanding the device that had facilitated Harold's treachery. "There's something here," she said suddenly, her fingers tracing intricate patterns in the bronze. "Hidden mechanisms, compartments within compartments. This isn't just an encoding device, it's a complete intelligence system." Hrolf paused in his examination of the door's massive hinges. "What do you mean?" "Look at these runes, they're not just decorative. They form a secondary lock mechanism that opens different sections of the device." Her excitement grew as understanding dawned. Harold wasn't just using this to encode messages. He was using it to store copies of everything, every communication with Frankish agents, every payment record, every detail of the conspiracy. The implications struck Hrolf like a physical blow. He kept records of his own treason? "Think about it from his perspective," Celeste said, continuing to manipulate the bronze wheels. "If he's planning to present the Jarls with evidence of Frankish strength, he'd need proof of the existing network. And if he ever needed leverage against his Frankish masters..." The device clicked open with a sound like breaking ice, revealing compartments filled with tiny scrolls, no larger than a man's finger. Each scroll bore writing so small it required squinting to read, but the contents were devastating. Payment schedules showing exactly how much gold each corrupted Jarl had received. Copies of intelligence reports that had been passed to Frankish agents. Most damning of all, correspondence between Harold and King Louis himself, outlining the complete plan for Norway's subjugation. "This is everything we need," Hrolf said, understanding the magnitude of their discovery. "With these records, we could expose not just Harold, but the entire network. But first, we need to escape this tomb." The sound of footsteps echoed beyond the cell door, accompanied by the jingle of keys and muffled voices. Torchlight flickered under the door's gap as guards approached. Whether to feed them or execute them remained unclear. Hrolf gripped his war axe, though in the confined space its effectiveness would be limited. "Stand away from the door," called a voice that carried the authority of rank. "The king wishes to speak with his guests before their final disposition." The massive portal swung open to reveal 6 guards in royal livery, their weapons drawn but not immediately threatening. Behind them stood a figure that made Hrolf's blood run cold. Eric Longbeard, his own trusted warrior, wearing the colours of Harold's personal guard. "Eric," Hrolf said, his voice heavy with betrayal's bitter weight. "I should have known. How long have you served the Northern Wolf?" His former friend's weathered face showed genuine regret, though his hand remained steady on his sword hilt. "Since before your father died." "Old friend." Someone had to ensure the transition of power went smoothly when Harold claimed the throne. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Eric had been positioned to watch Hrolf from the beginning, to ensure that Bjorn Ironshield's son remained loyal to the new order. Even their escape from Gull Rock had been allowed, designed to lead them here, where Harold could eliminate them away from public view. "The winter assembly begins in 2 hours, Eric continued. "Harold wants you to witness the ceremony where Norway officially accepts Frankish protection. He thought you might appreciate the historical significance." "Protection?" Celeste laughed bitterly. "Is that what he calls it when a king sells his people into slavery?" "He calls it survival," Eric replied simply. "And history will prove him right. The Franks would come whether we resisted or not, at least this way. Norwegian blood doesn't water the fjords." They were escorted through passages that bypassed the main compound, emerging into a balcony overlooking the Great Hall, where Norway's Jarls had assembled for the winter gathering. Hrolf recognized every face in the crowd, men who'd fought beside his father, leaders who'd sworn oaths to defend their people's freedom. Now they sat unknowing, while their king prepared to trade that freedom for Frankish gold. Harold stood at the hall's head table, magnificent in his royal regalia, the very picture of a strong king addressing his vassals. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, stood men whose clothing and bearing marked them as foreign dignitaries, the Frankish observers who'd come to witness Norway's surrender. "Honored Jarls," Harold began, his voice carrying easily through the timber hall, "we gather tonight to discuss threats that face our homeland and opportunities that could secure our people's future for generations to come." A murmur ran through the assembled leaders. This was not the traditional format for a winter assembly. Usually such gatherings focused on settling disputes and planning the coming year's raids. "Recent intelligence has revealed a conspiracy against Norwegian independence," Harold continued, his words carefully chosen to shape the narrative. "Foreign agents, aided by traitors within our own ranks, have sought to destabilize our kingdom through violence and deception." Hrolf felt his heart sink as he realized Harold's strategy. The king would present edited versions of the truth, casting himself as Norway's protector while painting any resistance as foreign-inspired rebellion. "To counter these threats," Harold said, producing documents from his robes, "I have negotiated a defensive alliance with our neighbors to the south. The Frankish kingdoms offer us protection and partnership, ensuring that Norwegian independence remains intact under a broader framework of mutual cooperation." The hall erupted in shocked voices as Jarls realized what was being proposed. Some shouted approval, others demanded clarification, but none had access to the full truth about Harold's treachery. They were being asked to vote on a proposal based entirely on their king's word. "The choice before us is simple," Harold declared, his voice cutting through the tumult. "We can accept partnership with a superior power and secure our people's survival, or we can cling to outdated notions of independence and watch our children die in a war we cannot win." From the balcony, Hrolf watched the faces of men he'd known since childhood, seeing doubt and fear replace the certainty that had always characterized Viking leadership. Harold's words were carefully crafted poison, designed to make submission seem like wisdom. "Now," Celeste whispered, her hand gripping the crown of shadows. "If we're going to act, it has to be now." Hrolf looked at the guards surrounding them, calculated the distance to the hall's main floor, and weighed the odds of survival against the certainty that silence meant Norway's doom. The rescue stone hung at Celeste's throat, smooth and grey as the fjord waters where their journey had begun, a reminder that some acts of courage required leaping into dark waters without knowing what lay beneath. "For Norway," he said quietly, and launched himself over the balcony's rail toward the hall below. Hrolf's massive frame crashed into the great hall's central table with a sound like breaking thunder, sending wooden bowls and drinking horns flying in all directions. Around him, Norway's most powerful jarls leaped to their feet in shock as the man they'd thought was Harold's prisoner stood before them, bloodied but unbroken. Above on the balcony, Celeste fought desperately with the guards who'd tried to prevent their escape, the crown of shadows clutched against her chest like a lifeline. "Jarls of Norway," Hrolf roared, his voice cutting through the chaos that had erupted throughout the hall. "Before you cast your votes, hear the truth about the man who would sell your children into slavery." Harold's face went white as fresh snow, his carefully orchestrated deception crumbling in an instant. "Seize him!" he commanded the guards stationed around the hall. "This man is a traitor and a murderer." But the jarls had heard Hrolf's words, and something in his tone gave them pause. These were men who'd known Bjorn Ironshield, who remembered when the Stronghand family's word was worth more than gold. They wanted to hear what Harold's prisoner had to say before silencing him forever. 3 months ago, Hrolf began, blood streaming from cuts sustained in his fall. "A woman nearly drowned in my fjord. When I pulled her from the water, I thought I was saving a stranger's life. Instead, I discovered a conspiracy that reaches to the very heart of this kingdom." Celeste appeared beside him as if by magic, having somehow escaped the guards and descended to the hall floor. In her hands, she held the bronze device that had facilitated years of treachery. "This is the crown of shadows," she announced, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the timber hall. "The tool your king has used to coordinate with Frankish agents for over a decade." The assembled jarls pressed closer, their faces showing mixtures of disbelief, anger, and growing understanding. Harold attempted to speak, but Gunnar Ironside, King Harold's own cousin, raised a massive fist for silence. "Let them finish," he commanded. "These are serious accusations." "Your king is the Northern Wolf," Hrolf declared, the words falling into the hall like drops of poison into a well. "For years, he's fed intelligence to Frankish agents, compromised your defenses, and prepared the way for an invasion disguised as an alliance." Celeste activated the Crown of Shadows with practiced efficiency, its bronze wheels clicking into position as hidden compartments opened to reveal their damning contents. Every payment, every secret pass to the enemy, every detail of the plan to subjugate Norway, it's all here, in Harold's own records. The king's composure finally cracked completely. "You fools!" he screamed, his face contorting with rage and desperation. "They offer you annihilation disguised as honor. The Frankish fleet numbers 300 ships. Every warrior in Norway couldn't defeat such a force. But united, we might survive it," replied Jarl Thorkel the Bold, his scarred face grim with understanding. "While divided and betrayed from within, we're already dead." The truth spread through the hall like wildfire as Jarls examined the evidence for themselves. Payment schedules that corresponded with intelligence leaks. Correspondence between Harold and King Louis discussing Norwegian integration into the Frankish Empire. Most damning of all, detailed plans for eliminating Jarls who might resist the new order. "The Winter Fleet," gasped Olaf Goldbeard, reading one of the tiny scrolls. "He's already told them which harbours are undefended, which settlements lack adequate warning systems." Harold drew his sword in a final desperate gesture, but found himself facing 20 angry Jarls whose patience had reached its end. These were men who'd built their reputations with steel and blood, who'd followed him out of respect for royal authority. Now that authority lay shattered like thin ice underfoot. "It didn't have to be this way," Harold said, his voice hollow with defeat. "I tried to save what could be saved. You'll all die for your stubborn pride." "Perhaps," Hrolf replied, moving to stand beside the other Jarls as they formed a circle around their fallen king. "But we'll die as free men, not as slaves who sold their birthright for the promise of easy chains." The trial was brief but thorough. By dawn, a new king had been chosen, Gunnar Ironside, whose first decree was to send warning ships to every settlement along Norway's coast. The Frankish fleet would find defenders ready for them, united by the knowledge that their survival depended on standing together rather than falling separately. As spring returned to the fjords and the first trading ships brought news from the south, word spread of a great naval battle where Norwegian longships had held their own against Frankish warships. The invasion had been turned back, though the cost in blood and treasure would be felt for years to come. Hrolf and Celeste stood once more beside the waters where their journey had begun, watching their own children play among the rocks where he'd first heard her desperate cry for help. The rescue stone sat on their mantelpiece now, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of courage begin with the simple decision to help a stranger in need. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd chosen differently?" Celeste asked, her hand finding his as they watched the sun set over waters that remained free. "No," Hrolf replied simply, thinking of all the children who would grow up knowing only Norwegian skies because one man had chosen honor over convenience. "Some choices right themselves, we just have to be brave enough to make them." In the distance, the sound of ship horns announced the return of trading vessels from distant lands, carrying goods and stories that would enrich the kingdom through honest commerce rather than corrupt gold. Norway had survived its greatest test, not through submission, but through the recognition that some things, freedom, honor, the right to choose one's own destiny, were worth any price required to preserve them. The waves lapped gently at the shore, carrying away the last traces of winter ice and bringing with them the promise of seasons yet to come. In those waters, a love had been born that would endure long after the songs of their deeds faded from memory, proving once again that the most powerful force in the world wasn't armies or gold or political cunning, but the simple decision of one person to risk everything for another. And in the years that followed, when bards sang of Hrolf Stronghand and the foreign woman who'd helped save Norway from betrayal, they always began the same way. Sometimes the greatest act of courage comes not from battle, but from the moment we choose to save a stranger. For it was in that choice, made without thought of reward or consequence, that the seed of their salvation had been planted. The fjord lay quiet now as it had that first morning, but the silence held peace instead of threat. And if you knew where to look among the scattered stones along the shore, you could still find smooth grey pebbles worn round by countless tides, small reminders that even the mightiest forces, given enough time and persistence, could reshape the world.